Okay, good morning, everyone. I am Michael David Fox. I am director of the Center for Eurasian Russian East European Studies here at Georgetown University's School of Foreign Service, which is hosting this event. Our sponsor is the Carnegie Foundation of New York. Russia Brief is moderated and organized by Jill Dougherty, our very own adjunct professor at CERES, formerly with CNN as White House correspondent, State Department correspondent, and Moscow bureau chief. Today, we are very pleased to welcome Ambassador John Beyrle in a discussion of when things fall apart, can U.S.-Russia relations be rebuilt? Over to you, Jill.
Okay, thank you very much, Michael. And welcome to Russia Brief, our monthly online discussion of issues on Russia and the region. And, I was wondering where we should start this, because there's so much breaking news. And as a former journalist, or maybe continuing journalist, I immediately kind of glom onto the most immediate things, and I want to get into that. A lot of it, unfortunately, is not good news about Ukraine. But the reason that I want to speak with Ambassador Beyrle is for this longer picture of where U.S.-Russian relations go way down in the future, because we really are at a turning point. If you look at this war, it's affecting not only Europe, it's affecting the entire world. As proof, all of us know that, let's say, the Black Sea grain deal that allowed exports from Ukraine of its wheat and other grains seems to have collapsed. But again, we're going to try to look down the road at this relationship. And there's no question, been seriously damaged, perhaps even worse than it was during the Cold War. So we're going to try to answer that question that Michael talked about. Can U.S.-Russia relations be rebuilt? And I think that's the word. So Ambassador Beyrle, I know people know your bio, but just a reminder that you've served as an American diplomat for more than 3 decades in foreign postings and domestic. And you were totally focused on Central and Eastern Europe, the Soviet Union, and Russia. And you were ambassador twice, once to Bulgaria and also to Russia. And I would add, since I know Ambassador Beyrle quite well, while he was in Moscow, he did, in fact, in those days, lead to implementation of policies that did result in improved relations between Russia and the United States, and point in fact or witness the New START arms control agreement. And even that, of course, is under stress, as Russia has suspended its involvement in that agreement. So anyway, welcome, Ambassador Beyrle.
Thanks, Jill. Hello, everybody.
All right, so what we're going to do is Ambassador Beyrle and I will talk for about 35 minutes. And during that time, you can be taking notes and getting your questions ready. And then we'll try to give 25 minutes for questions from the audience. And I know we always get a lot, and they're always very good. So you will submit those through the Q&A function down at the bottom of your screen, Q&A. So in the spirit of starting with the news today, Ukraine continuing to be a catalyst for catastrophe. It's really a momentous day. We have here in Washington, as we speak, Volodymyr Zelensky is on Capitol Hill making that pitch to members of Congress to continue helping Ukraine. He was at the UN yesterday, a big push to continue that support. But there are those, Ambassador Beyrle, maybe we start with this. There are those on Capitol Hill who claim that Russia, or I should say the war in Ukraine, is not America's war, that we really don't have any vital interest in that. What do you say to that opinion?
Well, that's a misguided opinion, in my opinion. Of course, we have a stake in what's happening in Ukraine right now. We have a stake in making sure that countries adhere to the UN Charter, which says very clearly that it is illegal to take another country's territory by force, and that's exactly what's happening in Russia right now. And history, even recent history of the 20th century, is replete with examples of instances in which autocrats, dictators are allowed to think that they have no opposition to their expeditionary empire building, and we pay a larger price down the road for that. So I think what we're doing in Ukraine now, supporting the Ukrainians, certainly politically, diplomatically, and militarily, is a tremendous investment in our national security, and it's costing us relatively little in terms of the money that we spend in our defense budget. I think the arms for Ukraine are a very, very small percentage of that. And obviously we don't have any American troops on the ground. There's no talk about that happening at all. Although I thought it was interesting, I saw a poll yesterday that said 12% of the American people, some figure like that, would be willing to send American troops to Ukraine. That shows that there is a support, there's an understanding that something vital is at stake here. And as long as the Ukrainians continue to put up a good fight, as long as the Ukrainians tell us what they need and we can see that what we're providing them is making a material difference in helping them not only push back against the Russians, but possibly even to reclaim the territory that Russia has annexed illegally, then we have to do it. Because if we wait, we'll spend a lot more money and a lot more blood, unfortunately, in years to come in other parts of the world, perhaps. Taiwan comes to mind.
Yeah. Do you see any sign that Putin is ready to end this war? I mean, he's a man that, you know, you've dealt with, you've talked with him, and you've observed him. And in fact, today, there is a massive bombing campaign all over Ukraine, from east to west. So is Putin ready, in your estimation, to even get close to ending this war?
Putin is close to ending, is ready to end this war anytime he wants. The problem is the end of the war, the ceasefire, has to be on his terms. He wants to start from a maximalist position in any negotiations, any diplomatic resolution of the war. And so it's in his interest right now to, through this, what I would call the strategic bombing campaign, to try to sap the will and morale of the Ukrainian people and to fortify defenses around those parts of Russia, which Russia already claims, to make sure that the Ukrainians pay a heavy price for trying to take that back. But if the Ukrainians said, we want to sue for peace today, we want to start talking about a ceasefire, Putin would be only happy to do that, because he sees himself in the driver's seat at this point. He controls a lot of territory in Ukraine, which Russia sees as strategically vital. Crimea and the land bridge that they built now between Crimea along the coast, going northeast up to the Donbass. So Putin is ready, but ready only on his terms.
Mm-hmm. You know, Ambassador Beyrle and I have known each other for a number of years, and we have some history in common back in the old Cold War days when we were studying Russian, et cetera. And I'm recalling one of the best conversations I ever had with you was in a restaurant in, what was it, the Yevropeyskaya Hotel in St. Petersburg, at the anniversary of an exchange, a student exchange program. This is a few years ago, and it was really good to see you there. And I'm remembering in those halcyon days that actually we felt very much at home. We were welcomed, and yet now the Kremlin is making it almost impossible for students on either side to get to the other country to study. Relations diplomatically and militarily, every other way are really bad. Do you think that there is any, well, let me put it this way. How do you assess objectively the relationship between the United States and Russia at this point?
Well, that's a big question, but it can have a very short answer, and the answer is unprecedented, almost unimaginable tension in the relationship right now. And this is a relationship that, as you said, you and I have been dealing with for decades. I first went to the Soviet Union in 1976 on that very exchange program that you described, and served my first tour at the American Embassy, 1983 to 1985, which we saw as a nadir in U.S.-Soviet relations. The Soviet Union shot down the Korean airliner over Sakhalin Island, killing 260 innocent people. Ronald Reagan called Russia famously the evil empire. Russia walked out of arms control talks in Europe designed to get rid of an entire class of nuclear weapons. Things looked pretty bad at that point. And yet, 3-4 years later, Ronald Reagan had decided he agreed with Margaret Thatcher that Mikhail Gorbachev was someone he could do business with. So, I've seen very low points in the relationship rebound fairly quickly to highs in which tensions are low and in which we get things done together. The same thing happened when I arrived as ambassador in Moscow in 2008. Russia was fighting the war in Georgia, a very brief war, but a war which ended with Russia declaring the independence of 2 breakaway provinces in Georgia. And we thought at that point that the U.S.-Russia relationship was headed in another extremely negative direction. And yet 1 year later, President Obama arrived in Moscow for a summit at which he and then President Dmitry Medvedev laid the groundwork for the signing of the New START treaty that you talked about. At that point, Russia was facilitating the transit of American troops and military materiel across Russia into Afghanistan to help America fight the war in Afghanistan. So the problem here is that not that things like detente or the reset, Obama-Medvedev reset, it's not that they're failures. They actually create the objective conditions to get things done, like the New START treaty. The whole arms control enterprise really came out of the détente period during the Nixon administration. It's not that we can't get things done. It's not that these are failures. It's that they never last. Making it possible to sustain these kinds of periods in which tensions are low and common cause is high has really been the challenge of my career in diplomacy. And so it's tempting, it's easy and maybe tempting for me to say, and now we're in another deep dip, and we need only await the arrival of manna from heaven or Deus ex machina, and we'll be looking at 3 or 4 years in a revived, rebuilt U.S.-Russia relationship. Alas, ouvui, as the Russians say, that's not the case, because what has happened under Vladimir Putin in the last, well, since 2014, but especially since the most recent invasion of Ukraine, is qualitatively different. And it puts Russia on in a sort of isolation internationally that makes it very hard to imagine that America is going to be able to have the sort of productive relationship that we had with Russia in the years that I talked about. The goal at this point is not to develop a productive relationship with Russia. That would be the goal, but it's very aspirational, not realistic. The goal is to do all we can to ensure that Russia's activity on the world stage is not obstructive, that it does not make it difficult and impossible to maintain international order, not to mention to work on some of the major issues facing us in the 21st century, and that's still proliferation and growth of nuclear arms, climate control, and even the hardy perennial terrorism. We in Russia used to work very closely together on terrorism. You can make the case that Russia is a terroristic state now, based on what we're seeing them carry out in Ukraine. So the relationship can be rebuilt, but it will be rebuilt in a very different way than we thought maybe in the early 1990s, even during the reset. When I was ambassador under President Obama, we're going to be dealing with a Russia which is much more obstructive and obstreperous internationally. And that means we need to do all we can to contain that aspect. There's a word from U.S. Russia history, but we do need to contain that predilection of Russia, especially in terms of its military expeditionism right now.
So, but how do you do that? I mean, I always have this image of the relationship as kind of like a mechanism, a mechanical thing where you really need a structure, because right now even the structure is gone. You know, neither side talking to each other, ambassadors yanked out of each capital. Right now, the U.S. Embassy has almost nobody there, very few people left. So how do you even work on trying to stop or contain, as you put it, that obstructionism in a really hands-on, you know, concrete fashion? What do you do?
Well, it seems paradoxical almost, but the way to do this is through very careful engagement, both with the Russian power structure, both with the Kremlin and with the Russian people. And let me start with engagement with the Russian government, with the Kremlin. In fact, we have not pulled our ambassadors out of each country. They've gone back for consultations, but we both have stopped short of abrogating diplomatic relations because both sides realize that at times like this, when the tensions are extremely high, when the stakes are as crucial as they are, we need to be talking to each other to avoid misperceptions which can lead to really catastrophic consequences. So even though the relationship is as tense as I can recall it in my career, we still have an ambassador and a reduced embassy in Moscow, which is talking to the Russian foreign ministry, talking to the presidential administration. I know there are meetings that go on between our current ambassador there and individuals in the presidential administration who have worked closely with the United States in the past. And all of this is designed to ensure that we're not sending false signals to each other, that we don't misunderstand what's happening on the ground. I'll give you a good example of why that's important. During the war between Russia and Georgia that I mentioned in 2008, the then chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Admiral Mike Mullen, had developed a very, very good relationship with his counterpart, the chief of defense on the Russian side. I want to say his name was Gerasimov, but I'm not sure that's right. In any event, these two men had a trusting relationship, which allowed them to pick up the phone directly and talk to each other. And that allowed Chairman Mullen to call Gerasimov several times and say, you're going to see American fighters over the Black Sea. Here's where they're going. Here's where they're not going. Here's why they're doing it. And here's when it will end. And the Russians, to a degree, did the same thing with us to ensure that there wasn't an accidental confrontation, because that's still what we need to fear most in the relationship between Russia and the United States, especially when our militaries sometimes are in such close proximity to each other. So that diplomatic engagement is absolutely crucial, even more crucial at times of high tension, but very difficult to make productive. It simply is good at keeping lines of communication open, making sure that bad things don't happen, but it's almost incapable of making any good things happen. Briefly, to get to the other side of that, engagement with the Russian people. And I think this is extremely important and perhaps most misunderstood by the American people. There's a tendency on Capitol Hill, there's a tendency in the American electorate to not be able to make a distinction between Putin's Kremlin and Russia as a whole, a country of 145 million people. Most of those people in no way bear a responsibility for what's happening in Ukraine. There's an argument I know that you can make to say these people, if they had only gotten out in the street and protested and overthrown Putin, this simply would not have happened. There are objective parameters in which you can argue, if you understand the way that power flows in Russia, why that's not a likelihood. But more importantly, I think the idea of assigning collective guilt to an entire nation of people is something that we as America have really never done. We certainly didn't do it with Japan or Germany after World War II. So we need to be able to make a distinction. As a friend of mine says, don't give in to Putin, but don't give up on Russia. And that means understand that there is a majority of Russians who are not buying the propaganda line out of the Kremlin that the West's only goal is to weaken and undermine the Russian state, and make it possible to the extent that we can to allow Russian students, scientists, cultural activists to have contact with the United States, possibly even to study here, to travel here, because it's through that contact that we push back against the narrative from the Kremlin that I mentioned. And this is extremely important because the Russian society now is porous. It's porous in a way that's, I think, never been true before in its history. That means that we have inroads and that Russians have outroads for the first time.
In what way?
They can still travel freely to the West to the extent that they're accepted, that their visas are accepted. The internet is still not censored in Russia, certainly not to the degree that it is in China. The strength of the let's say, I'll call them imperial nostalgics. They used to be called Slavophiles. Those who see Russia as a unique civilization, neither European nor Asian, which plays by its own rules and is very wary about encroachment from the outside world. That narrative has always depended on the ability to control the perception of the Russian people. It certainly worked during most of the 20th century until the breakup of the Soviet Union. People were not able to travel out. Information was not able to get in as easily as now. We had Voice of America, which I think you worked for at one point. Maybe it was your sister, I can't remember.
I did.
You did, I did too. But that was a very small percentage of people. Now it's much easier to get the truth into Russia, and that truth works against that narrative that Russia is unique, that the outside world is bent only on Russia's destruction. You could sell that bill of goods to the Russians in the 1930s and the early 1950s. You can't sell it to them now. And if we understand that, and we understand that part of that is keeping the doors open to Russian people who, in their heart of hearts, even though when the phone rings and the pollster says, do you support Vladimir Putin? They say yes. They probably don't as much as the polls show. And we really need to understand that. Not that the Russian people are going to rise up and unseat Vladimir Putin, but simply that they want a different future for their country. They want a future in which their country is engaged with the world, not at odds with it.
You know, I want to get into Putin in a second, but just remind people, if you have some questions, excuse me, that you put them in Q&A, and we'll be getting to that in 5 or 10 minutes at the very most. But I just today got a text from a friend who is Russian, who is in Russia, and they use this phrase that I'm sure you've heard. I'll translate in a second, but they said, "Народ плохой, а люди хорошие." So yeah, for those, I'm sure there are a lot of people in Russia who speak Russian, but it's basically like the Russian people are bad, but people are good. So there is that distinction, I think, that can be made, although we could have another hour on exactly what you said, because I know a lot of people would like to debate that, but that's what this is all about. But speaking of Putin, you mentioned that sometimes the good times don't last. They simply don't. And I wanted to say why not? But which raises the question of Putin. So if the United States right now wants to establish, or let's say, I shouldn't say establish, but to repair or rebuild the relationship, what do you do to take into consideration that Vladimir Putin, who is 70 years old, will not be around forever? And how do you prepare for that eventuality at the same time that you try to strengthen whatever type of relationship we have?
Well, Vladimir Putin, I think, certainly took advantage of a tendency, maybe historical characteristic of Russia, the Russian people, to view the West and the outside world with suspicion. Certainly that was drilled into Russian DEA after the Bolshevik takeover in 1918 through the Cold War. And really up until the point the Soviet Union fell apart in 1989. So when Putin preaches that the West is out to undermine, destroy Russia, that Russian values are inimical to Western corrupt values, which want to corrupt Russia itself, he's singing a song that many Russians can sing along with, unfortunately. And we have to keep this in mind, that there is that we have an uphill battle that we have to fight. And we have to understand that when Vladimir Putin departs the scene, as he will eventually, maybe this year, maybe in 5 years, hopefully not in 10 years, we're not going to be dealing with a Russia which immediately reverts to a warm and fuzzy relationship with the United States and the West. Russia simply has gone through too much, has perpetrated too much over the last, let's say, 10 years almost, to make it really possible to welcome them back into the family of nations in the way we aspired to. So we have to deal with Putin as long as Putin is there, but we have to understand that he'll likely be replaced by what I would call maybe a version of Putin light. Still anti-Western, but not virulently anti-Western. Still bent on preeminence and dominance in its sphere of influence, as it sees it, the former Soviet Union, but not to the extent of launching expeditionary wars, for example. And that change, as subtle as it might be, will give us an opportunity to begin to engage and to perhaps lessen the international isolation which Russia hates. which the Russian leadership certainly doesn't welcome. It blames the West for that as well. But Russia does want to be welcomed into the family of nations. It wants to be an influential country, not a pariah. And that will always give us some advantage in dealing with the people in the Kremlin who are making political, ideological decisions, because there our interests coincide, certainly. We're also interested in seeing a Russia which is less isolated and more constructive. The devil is in the details, but that's what diplomats and statesmen deal in, how to take that aspiration and actually turn it into concrete results.
You know, there's a question I think that I'll go to. I'm noticing Nigel Lee asking, because it's very much in this concept of the leader and Putin. Mr. Lee asks, do we need another Gorbachev-like figure for detente to be possible? On top of that, how do we ensure sustainable detente that is institutionalized and not dependent on personalities in the Russian state?
Well, as I said, it's very tempting, but I think dangerous to look at historical antecedents as a possible formula for future progress in Russia. We're very unlikely to see a Gorbachev-like figure who was truly revolutionary in what he did to the Soviet Union. Perhaps unwittingly, he didn't desire for the Soviet Union to fall apart, but it certainly did. As I think I said earlier, we're in a completely qualitatively different era now, where Russia's war on Ukraine, whether it goes on for 3 more months or 3 more years, means that Russia bears a tremendous responsibility economically, first and foremost, for at some point the rebuilding of Ukraine. And the last estimates I saw from the World Bank is that the rebuilding of Ukraine is something like a $500 billion enterprise. So that's going to be something that we're pushing very, very hard on with any new administration, post-Putin administration. And yes, we do need to establish institutions, but I think the institutions that matter and will matter in the near term or during that post-Putin era are international institutions, not bilateral institutions. We need to ensure that Russia continues to be engaged in the United Nations. We need to be able to deal with them at the G20. All of these are forums in which Russia can understand that the criticisms and complaints against its behavior are not coming solely from the West. They're rooted in international experience in the UN Charter. And I think those are the institutions that we need to try to use to help mold Russian behavior, or at least direct Russian behavior in a different direction, different way than it's been going in the past years. But yeah, I think it's just very unlikely to hope for the reemergence of a new Gorbachev who will sweep all of this away and lead us into a brighter future. It's not going to happen.
Mm-hmm. Michael David Fox, could I turn to you? Do you have a question for
Yes, I've been listening to all of this with great interest. And well, historians don't like to predict the future. So who knows who may succeed Putin? Really, things can change very quickly in Russia. But my question actually is about the challenges raised by some of the points you've made, Ambassador Beyrle. Like you mentioned the word containment, but the U.S. is now engaged in a kind of dual containment against China and Russia at the same time, which is rather unprecedented, and also in a time of political polarization within the US. So I'm interested in the kinds of thoughts you may have on the challenges of doing that. And in particular, I was very intrigued by the point you made about, people-to-people exchanges, academic exchanges, keeping the lines open, because that's something that I do a lot with Russian academics and cultural and educational exchange, and I've been going there pretty much every year for 30 years until the pandemic. But right now, that kind of exchange also faces challenges. For one thing, if you try to do an event with, say, Russians you would like to engage, you get a lot of pushback from Ukrainians, quite understandably, who would boycott such events. And also there's a tendency to kind of, as you say, in the United States, to kind of just boycott everything Russian. So there are challenges in that realm too. I'm just interested in your thoughts on both counts.
Well, let me start with the trilateral axis with the U.S. China-Russia relationship. I'm always reminded of Henry Kissinger's famous saying that America's goal should be to have better relations with Russia and with China than China and Russia have between themselves. We're at exactly the opposite position right now. Both our relationship with China and Russia are tense and in a very undesirable state, and the Russian-Chinese relationship is, you can argue, as close as it's ever been. But there's a big difference today between 30, 40 years ago, and that is the size of China. The tables really have been turned. Russia used to be the dominant player in that equation. Certainly the Soviet Union was. Today, China is. China's economy is 4 times bigger than Russia's. China's population is 10 times greater than Russia. So Russia, when it looks at China now, looks to a country which it has to fear, which, if it's honest with itself, poses the greatest strategic threat to Russia's future, especially in terms of resources and territory, than the West does. And I think that if we're smart, we can turn to our advantage, because the Chinese are extremely happy with the war that's happening in Ukraine right now, or at least they don't oppose it because they see that it is making Russia more dependent on China, to the degree that Russia is closed off from the West, especially economically, in terms of exports, in terms of financing. It turns to China and, in essence, becomes a junior partner in that relationship in a way that rankles Russia very much. We don't hear very much about the Belt and Road Initiative anymore, but I think it's still, part of Chinese's aspirational policy. And Russia always sort of paid lip service to the Belt and Road Initiative. Publicly, they'd say, we support this. It promotes Eurasian connectivity. But in reality, Russia was always, very suspicious of Chinese inroads into what it sees as its sphere of influence, the Central Asia, for one example. And Russia never wants to march under a Chinese banner. So understanding that China and Russia are not fated to be allies, that they're allies or partners, let's say, of convenience right now, makes, I think, it possible for us to work harder on improving the relationship with China, which the Biden administration, I think, manifestly just in the last 4 or 5 months has taken some fairly important steps to try to facilitate. And in doing that, Russia will feel itself more isolated in a way that may drive it more quickly to a resolution of the Ukrainian war in a way that's not solely on Russian terms. It's a very difficult diplomatic dance, but it, I think, has to be keyed on trying to improve the relationship between between Washington and Beijing, because that simply will give us more leverage against Russia. As far as your question about sort of the collective guilt question, as somebody who has promoted Russian studies, who came out of Soviet area studies in my early years as a student and academic, I understand the push in academia now to what's called decolonize Russian studies and decenter Russian studies and focus more on the region as a whole: Ukrainian studies, Central Asian studies, Baltic studies. That's much to be desired, but it cannot come at the expense of a focus on Russia itself, because it's not Belarus which is threatening nuclear annihilation. It's not Kazakhstan which is launching a war into Tajikistan, not to mention Ukraine. Russia is the big player here. Russia, for better or for worse, will be a determinant of global policy and global status for decades to come. And we need to work as hard as we can to ensure that we have the expertise as Americans to understand Russia, to be able to engage with Russia in a way that is productive, not simply Americans pushing their way forward. And that's a tremendous investment that takes years and years. And so even as we broaden the field of study to encompass more of Ukraine, more of Central Asia, more of the former Soviet region, to include Eastern Europe, if you take in the Warsaw Pact, we need to focus also on making sure that we're as strong as we can be in scholarly, academic, and policy expertise vis-a-vis Russia, because that is the only thing that will allow us to take advantage of the opportunities that are bound to present themselves to pull Russia off of this path that it's on and put it in a more hopefully constructive mode vis-a-vis the international community.
I have another question, Ambassador Beyrle, which was sparked by what you were talking about. Right now, we have really an enormous diaspora of Russians. I've seen estimates from like 1, maybe even 2 million people have fled, some of them journalists, others, to avoid the draft or the mobilization. And they're scattered all over the place, especially in Europe, some in Georgia, et cetera. So you have this diaspora. I know that you were involved in trying to help people who've left the country, but it feels to me that there would be a delicate balance between helping them and not turning it into something that President Putin might depict as a fifth column, people who are out to take him down and who wish ill on Russia. How do you see, let's say, establishing that balance between these two forces or these two aspects of that relationship?
Well, it's I think in some ways difficult to talk about the Russian diaspora because certainly in the United States and even in Western Europe, it has never really been unified in a way that the Polish diaspora or the Armenian diaspora has been. There have been too many different currents and different interests in various groups which have left the Soviet Union, Jewish emigration in the 1980s, to, let's say, what the Russians call the brain drain, the movement of highly educated, highly technically and technologically competent people to Western Europe and especially to the United States. I think at one point there were 60,000 Russian passport holders in the greater San Francisco region, in the San Francisco Bay, around an incredible number. Now we have a new wave of, I wouldn't call it emigration, I would call it exile. That makes them part of the diaspora, but the difference in this group, unlike the 40,000 or 60,000 Russians who are living and working in and around Silicon Valley or the Boston corridor, is that the former group, those who are in exile now, don't want that to be a permanent condition. They want to be able to return to their country, and they want to see their country be the kind of place that they want to return to and that they can return to. You mentioned that we are trying to help that particular group. I'm the chairman of the U.S. Russia Foundation, which is a non-governmental nonprofit foundation, which ironically was established by Putin and George W. Bush in 2006 to promote economic cooperation and entrepreneurship in Russia. Now, obviously, the goals are quite changed, and our main objectives now are supporting independent media, Russian civil society, and scholars in exile to help them reestablish themselves, especially independent media, so that they can continue to broadcast, convey the truth into Russia, and civil society human rights organizations, which we always have a stake in keeping alive and keeping strong. Not only us. That's the focus of the U.S. Russia Foundation now. And there's a tremendous interest in our programs, the grants that we're giving, and all of that shows me that there is really a very strong nucleus of Russians from the Russian elite who see themselves temporarily exiled from their country, but want to continue to create the conditions inside the country that will pull it off the misguided path that it's taken.
You know, we only have, let's see, about 10 minutes to go. And I have a question. It's a little bit more maybe philosophical or even ideological. But right now, you've mentioned in the United States and really in the West, in Western Europe, Russia is toxic. You know, a lot of Russians aren't welcome in a lot of countries. But in Russia right now, you have the Kremlin, which has essentially rewritten textbooks for schools and has new programs that begin in the grade school, grammar school, and go all the way up to the university, which depict Russian history in the way that President Putin would depict it, which is, other countries don't matter. Russia is the main country in our particular region, that the West is corrupt and out to destroy Russia, et cetera. That narrative. So when I think about that, because teaching at Georgetown, I'm looking at students every day and thinking, look at the kids 10 years old in Russia who are taking apart guns right now, or dance troupes that are dancing. This is all on the internet, which you can see, dancing with Kalashnikovs. So this ideology is now being grounded in education, perhaps to affect young people for a very long time. And I know that happened in the Soviet Union and things can change, but how do you see bridging that divide? I mean, some of these people, not to jump on my own question, but the millions of people who are now abroad, who eventually may go back, could go back to a very different Russia.
Well, as you said, things can change. We saw much of what you described, perhaps even taking apart the Kalashnikovs during World War II, was the line that was purveyed by the Kremlin during the Cold War. And that changed very quickly after the Soviet Union broke apart. And we could say we had 20 years of the truth, maybe 25 years of the truth before the ideological and mendacious rigor started to creep back in. In some ways, I think that's the one of the easiest things to correct once things begin to change inside of Russia. But that's something that Russians themselves only can do, and that's why it's important that we continue to support the Russians who want to come to the West, who are in temporary exile right now, trying to create the conditions for a Russia which will be a productive member of the international community. I keep saying that. It sounds a bit like pie in the sky, but your aspirations have to be ambitious. Otherwise you're not going to get very far, because reality is always going to pull you back toward the center.
Yeah. Is there anybody, let's say, you don't have to use names, obviously, but recently that you have helped or have discussed this with, that a Russian perspective that might, put this, might frame this and give their own experience as to how they might go back to Russia and help the country?
Yes, in June, the U.S. Russia Foundation held our board meeting in Berlin, and we used that as an opportunity to convene a conference of Russian civil society, media, and educational activists in exile, many of whom have relocated to Berlin, but many came in from the Baltic states, some from the Caucasus. And over 2 days, we discussed this very thing. What is it, or I should say, when I say we, I should say they, because the Russians at that conference all had the same the same aspirations, but they weren't in close contact with each other. We tried to facilitate through this forum a way that they could build a network in which they could help each other, strength through numbers. And I heard many things over those 2 days, which were incredibly insightful from people like Zhana Nemtsova, for example, who runs the Nemtsov Foundation, named for her late father, in Germany. There are plenty of people like her, less well known, who are determined to ensure that they return to a Russia that plays more by the rules and is less of a pariah internationally, that builds the internal structures or components, not so much maybe of a democracy, but simply a polity that's in which the powers that be are more accountable to the people than is the case. Now, that's the ultimate goal. Not democracy per se, it's accountability. And that's what these people are really all about. Some of them are extremely plugged in, very smart, and they're all extremely energetic and ambitious. So I'm pretty bullish on the opportunity, on the possibility of that group of people actually making a difference in the I would say, short to medium term in Russia, in their country.
Yeah, that's always, I think, the difference, that below the surface are a lot of people who really do want to bring Russia back. I mean, I think the world can use Russia and its history, its culture, but it's a very, I've seen this, personally in meetings about Russia, with almost anybody who's in the field. It gets very contentious because, as Michael pointed out, Ukrainians do have a right to be furious at what's happening to their country. But I think this objective approach that you're talking about, Ambassador Beyrle, is really important, to look at, the structure of the relationship, and not to, without fear or favor, as they say, really try to continue that relationship. And I think it would help very much in, lowering some of the tone. The course that I teach at Georgetown is on propaganda and information wars. And as Michael knows, he's taught similar courses. That's part of it. part of disinformation is to make people furious and find an enemy and repeat that over and over again. And that's, I think, what we're seeing all over the world, certainly in Russia on their media, but also in the United States with this mood that is very anti-Russian. And I say that understanding why that is happening. But Russia's not going away, as we always say, and we're going to have to deal with it one way or the other. So I'm really grateful for your insight and a very balanced approach. It's rare these days, and I really appreciate it. And Michael, I don't know whether you have any last minute thoughts as we wrap this up.
I just want to add my appreciation also for the balance here. And having spent the last half year of my sabbatical in Berlin, I know that that is a center for all sorts of interesting crossroads for intellectuals, scholars, media, opposition figures. And I think that when thinking about this new diaspora, it's going to be very different from the interwar emigration after the revolution, which, all the these world-renowned figures end up driving taxis in Paris. Now we're in the age of the internet and Zoom, and so not just bricks and mortar meetings like the one you went to, Ambassador Beyrle, but these attempts that can be made for networking much more easily online.
Yeah, very much so. I would say that the reason for convening that conference was the understanding as a diplomat, I guess, that personal interaction is the key. That's really the only way you can build trust. You can't really build trust through a Zoom conference. You build trust by having eye-to-eye conversations where you speak your mind completely without fear of who might be listening to you. After that is developed to a certain degree, then the networking can take place in the way that we're doing it right now.
Yeah. Well, I'm grateful for this conversation. I want to thank our audience for listening and participating. And I also want to thank CERES, the Center for Eurasian, Russian, and East European Studies, which Michael leads, and the Carnegie Corporation of New York for its very generous support. We really, really appreciate that. And I hope that everybody can come back and join our next Russia Brief next month. We'll have another stimulating discussion. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.